we get underway here, I want to say many disclaimers. First, I am a lawyer, so I know about the 990, but I am not an accountant. And usually, lawyers and accountants have some kind of work together on a 990. So I'll do my best here, but I'm not, the end-all be-all person of the 990. So as you can see here, some of my materials come from me, some of them come from other reputable sources, some of them come from PricewaterhouseCoopers and their presentations on 990. So, and I have their permission, and special thanks to Laura Perello for being a champion for the sector and continuing to provide us with good information. So I just want to say I'm going to do my best. The other thing is the 990 is large. I have one right here. So if you ask me real detailed questions, I'm going to do my best, but it's a big document, and so if I don't have the answer like this, forgive me, but one of the things about being a lawyer that other lawyers know is you don't always have to know the answer off the top of your head. You just have to know where to find it. I know where to find all of the answers to your questions. They might just not be in my head. So forgive me if I'm not as speedy at the game show in this round as last round. Okay, so what is the 990? Again, much like what is a charity defined by the government. So the Form 990 is an annual filing to the federal government that provides information about public accountability, and the reason we want to check public accountability of following the rules is to make sure the entity deserves the charitable tax status that it has, that the contributions that went to the entity deserved the tax benefit they received, and that we should continue to see them as the same type of entity as they were the previous year or when they initially filed their Form 1023 and got their letter of determination. So this is all about, are you following the federal rules of being the type of organization listed on your determination letter? Okay? Great. So the Form 990, again, is looking at, are you following tax rules? So if you read a Form 990, well, I find them fascinating. You might find it a little dry. You might wonder why the government is asking those questions. It isn't because they're curious. It is because they are tied to laws and regulations specific to the charity. So they're not just curious. They are checking how you're following the law. So what does the 990 try to enforce? Reporting on financial matters, being clear about what your core activities are and how they relate to mission, how you provide information on tax matters, such as, do you still deserve your tax-exempt status? Are you still a public charity? Have you met the public support test? That's not a one-time and done. That's year over year over year. And there can be a year that you're out of whack, but you can't be 3 years completely off the grid, or they'll say, what's going on? Participation in direct or indirect transactions with insiders. Again, this goes back to what we talked about before. Both the charity has a benefit in the tax system, and so does the donor. And those benefits are provided because you've given up something. And for the donor, you've given up control of that money. And so they want to make sure the donor doesn't somehow get the control back, right? So an example the Treasury is pretty upset about right now that we've been talking a lot about is money comes into a donor advised fund, money goes out of a donor advised fund, money goes out to a nonprofit where the person who put the money into the donor advised fund sits on the board with 4 family members, and there's only 5 people on the board. Yeah. So this idea of, did you try to clean the money at some point only to further use it for your own control. You can't clean off the control if you get it back. And sometimes it takes, trails of following money to figure that out. The occurrence of certain tax acts. So they want to know, did you do anything to act like a business in any given year? And if you did, that's okay, but you've got to pay tax on those things that were unrelated business that you did. Now, unrelated business is not all business. A charity that has some business that goes back to mission doesn't necessarily have to pay unrelated business income. So just because somebody has a business side of what they're doing does not mean they aren't following the rules. There's just additional rules. Finally, you have to, nope, actually not finally. That's basically what I had to say there. Okay, so what does the 990 promote? So we know what it enforces. What does it promote? The 990 promotes financial and legal transparency. It provides you a picture of an organization at a specific point in time, right? This is not an organization, and it looks like this on one day a year. It doesn't look like that every day of every year ever, right? And that's why they have to do them annually, because organizations change and you have to show them. It provides some public understanding of a nonprofit and foundation's operations. Now I said operations, not necessarily program and grant impact, operations. This is the idea, are you operationally and legally sound? The next question is, are you having impact, right? But this 990 doesn't ask that question, it asks, are you following the rules? And then, does the government have the ability to take data from yours and other 990s and learn about the nonprofit sector? Some of you may have heard there's interest in digitizing the Form 990, and the pushback from our sector is, we get that, we get being online, we get it's easier to pull information together, but what about that Schedule B with people's information on it? How are you going to keep that safe? Will the Schedule B continue to be around if it goes online? So those are, again, questions when myself and the Treasury and IRS nerds are hanging out. That's what we debate. There are different types of Form 990s, just like there are different types of charities. And different types of charities have to do different 990s. So the 990 PF is for private foundations. The Form 990 is for public charities, including community foundations, and probably oftentimes healthcare conversion, although there could be exceptions. The Form 990 EZ, it's the easy version, is if you have gross receipts or gross assets under certain dollar amounts. Now, even if you can file the Form 990 EZ, not everybody does because they want to express more information. But the government recognizes administrative burden, and so at certain times they provide EZs, ways to simplify things for everyone, or for certain groups. Then you have the Form 990N, and very few organizations are allowed to file that anymore. And in fact, that's the filing that got a lot of people in trouble when the government decided to say anyone who hasn't filed recently, we're going to sweep you off the rolls of nonprofits. And then now they have a huge backlog of putting people back on the rolls because they were a proper charitable entity, but they weren't filing something annually. A postcard's too small, I guess. And so they forgot, and then they got taken off, and that reinstatement process is administratively burdensome for the IRS now. So the sections of the Form 990, sometimes you think, how the heck am I going to find what I need in the 990 unless I read it cover to cover? And while I like that, again, I understand if you don't. So here's the different sections. I also want to strongly encourage you to look at the online versions and use Control F for find, and then type in words that you want. That's what I do in the instructions when I need them, and it's amazing. So Control F gets you a long way to finding what you need, but there's the breakdown of the forms. Now, don't worry, if the government can make something burdensome, they might like to. So besides the Form 990 that explains what you do, there's schedules to explain your explanations, because we really want to make sure we explain ourselves. So these are the different schedules that any nonprofit may or may not need to fill out for their Form 990. Again, you heard me reference Schedule O. It's my favorite. So if you ever really want to cut to the chase, check out Schedule O, because that's a narrative where an organization really gets to tell you what they do. So, everyone go home, read your Schedule O's. You're going to love it. It's way better than watching TV. Start a book club of Schedule O's. That's my, I should do that in DC. People would do that. Okay, anyways, so that's the schedules. You can, what's that?
I said there has to be an app for that.
You know what? I'm going to see Knight Foundation. They love an app. I'm going to talk to them. They're going to be my first book club app member of the Schedule O's. I can't wait. We're going to have fun. Okay, so now with the Form 990 and knowing what it is, we had a great question earlier about, does it need to be available to the public? And this isn't me saying this. Again, this is the federal government saying, yes, it does. And you can make it available in two ways: office visits or making it widely available. And I have a whole slide about widely available, so don't worry. I will tell you what that means. And it's not just one of the 990s you file, it's all of the 990s that you file. So please make sure you think about not just your Form 990, but if you have a 990T, that also gets in there. In fact, in standards, the accreditation program, we tell people, you only say your Form 990 is available online. You have to also say your Form 990T, and they all come back to me and say, we don't have a Form 990T. We're not doing any unrelated business income tax. I was like, you still have to put it there in case you ever do. And that might seem silly, but that's the truth. And so don't forget your 990Ts. Also, you want to be able to make your application for exemption, your Form 1023, available for public disclosure. So that gets to the point, if an organization hasn't filed a 990 yet because they're new, you may request their Form 1023. You can ask for fees for copying and reasonable expenses, but those expenses need to be reasonable, and again, that's a facts and circumstances test. But if your Form 1023 isn't in off-site storage on carbon paper, we're talking about the expense of some copies. If it's on carbon paper and off-site storage, I might suggest you also have a copy in the office, but that's just me. So if the request comes in and it is a written request, the organization has 30 days to respond to you. If it is requested in person, it should be provided immediately unless there are circumstances that it's off-site and you need some time to provide it. And if you don't follow all of this, there are excise taxes that can be laid on the foundation for not doing this. Okay? All right. So making documents widely available, that actually means something. They didn't just throw it in there and say, figure it out. So what they mean is one of four things, right? So an internet posting or posting as part of a database could be one way, although most people's interpretation is GuideStar is not enough. So if GuideStar is putting it up for you, I still think you should have it in another place. So just remember that. And if you didn't know, GuideStar has your 990, whether you gave it to them or not, because they don't get it from you. They get it from public disclosure. Second, GuideStar.org is a website and an organization, and I'm sure I don't have its About Us in front of me, so I'm sure I would upset them by my explanation. But I know it as the place where you can go online and search organizations' 990s. They also allow organizations to log in and provide additional information that the 990 doesn't provide about programs and services and things like that. So it's meant to be a place where you can go learn about a lot of charities without going onto their individual websites. But again, that's not me reading their About Us section, so that's the best I got. Okay. The next thing is widely available means that it needs to be accurate and be able to be relied upon. So that means if you amended your 990, you need to be providing the amended version, not just the original version, right? And you should give notice of where to find it. So you can get it from the community foundation, you can get it from the public charity, or you can get it from an internet address, but people have to know how to find it. For private foundations, there's some additional information. And please know that oftentimes, if private foundation rules are more strict than community foundation rules, sometimes community foundations will follow them. They do not have to, but sometimes they do to be cautious. I'm not saying whether cautious is good or bad, I'm saying it's something some do. So according to 990 PF disclosure rules, you must make a return available for a 3-year period with beginning with the due date of the return and including any extensions for filing or amended pieces of the return. If it includes any schedules or attachments, they also have to be publicly available, with the exception of Schedule B, which can be redacted because, again, it has personal donor information on it and there's safety concerns there. You must disclose the name and address of your contributors, but again, for the public, those are redacted. The government gets them. Next, that's why 501c4s became so popular. Different tax deduction, but you don't have to disclose. So if anyone ever wonders, like, why are there so many C4s running around? It's because people don't like that. Next, you don't have to you are not required to provide a copy if you've made it publicly available, but you know, you might want to do that just to be nice and neighborly. And then if you have more questions about how this works, the Form 990, the Form 990 PF, and the instructions for both are online. And again, the Control F is a really, really helpful tool. So that's kind of what I like to talk about when I talk about 990s and sort of how to use them and how not to use them and how the foundations you work with use or don't use them. I'm going to go through a couple more slides, but please be thinking about your specific questions because I don't deep dive into any one question on the 990 in this intro, but if you have those questions, I certainly want to answer them. So we've talked a lot about what federal regulators worry about, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I'd like to spend a minute talking about what state charities officials see as their top 5 issues. First, the first #1 issue of state charities officials is absentee boards, right? People are busy. Are they coming to meetings? Are they letting one person control the board, right? And everyone's kind of nodding along. Are there conflicts of interest? Because the important thing to remember about a board of directors is that there's not just a conflict between a member of the board and a grantee or a service provider or a contractor. It's also, are there conflicts among the board? So if 3 people on a board of 5 have a business contract together, that is a conflict of interest. That is not an independent board unless that information is disclosed at any time and it's determined whether, because 3 of them are in a business deal together, that might make them vote together. So you have to be really careful in conflicts. And if we have enough time, I'll actually go further into this. It's not just the organization and external. It's around the table of the organization, staff, and board, and who's making decisions. So please remember among who, are there voting blocks? Voting blocks are actually not just people are friends, but do they have contractual business relationships that can be relied upon? Although I will say when it comes to friends, I did once have to break it to a scholarship committee that we knew people on the scholarship committee were neighbors and friends, and therefore our scholarship donors did have control of the scholarship committee, and they didn't like it, but we did get to the point with them where we said, we hear you and we're really sorry. If you'd like to take your money to another foundation, you are welcome to do that, but we will not break the law for you and risk the entire entity, even though we understand. And it was a really tough one because we had a member of that the reason the scholarship was set up was in a memorial of a lost child, and it was for a high school graduate, you know, at the school of that lost child. So we understand the emotions tied up in that. It wasn't fun to have that conversation, but I couldn't put the entire organization at risk for one grouping or one conflict that was clearly donor control. So the most important thing you can do, have a conflicts of interest policy. When a conflict comes up, always go through the same steps to decide if somebody is going to recuse themselves or not. Specifically, you know, I see this all the time. Someone recuses, or somebody brings up that they may have a possible conflict. The group decides they don't have a conflict, you move on. Don't forget to document that in the minutes. I know people say, oh, I only document votes, I only document discussions, I only document a conflict that's real. No, make sure that's in the minutes. Second, if that person discloses and then decides on their own or within the group that they should recuse, do you let them participate in the conversation? Do they step out? Do they get to stay in the room for the vote? Do they leave? You should decide what your procedure is, and you should be doing it every time. The most common thing I see with conflicts is that it's handled sort of like willy-nilly in the moment. At every board or committee meeting, that document should be with whoever's running the meeting, and if it comes up, you do steps every time, and those steps are done the same every time. Because one of the things about facts and circumstances when deciding if you had a conflict or not is, do you treat all conflicts, you know, in the same manner? Do you understand how to do the facts and circumstances test? And in the moment, it's easy to kind of sway back and forth. So you want to be real, real careful there. Is there a question? Okay. So next thing is board versus staff role reversal, or the phantom board. This is something I see in national standards all the time, and actually something that community foundations get really mad at me in the accreditation program for. They say, look, my board's a governing board. They don't need to know, you know, this or that or the other. We're delegating to committee. We're delegating to staff. We're delegating to I don't know who. And I say, you can delegate all you want, but tell me how that information gets back to the board. Tell me how the board understands what was done. And committee reports, as great as they are, who has ever sat in a board meeting with a consent agenda, with a committee report that everyone just kind of says, okay, to the finance, right? The finances, right? You have to be drilling into that stuff. So it's okay to delegate some things to a CEO or to staff or to committee, but you have to have a procedure in place for getting that information back up to the board. And I will say, in my experience, it is uncomfortable how this happens. And I would like to see more rigorous translation up to the board of what's going on. Because again, if you're investigated by a state or federal charities official, the question isn't, where was the CEO? Where was the staff member? It's, where was the board and what did they know? It wasn't, where was the committee chair and what did they know? It's not, where was the committee? It's the full board. And so if you have a committee chair and they're the one who knows something, are they the one-man band who's controlling that part of the conversation? Oh gosh, I forgot I have a touch screen, sorry. So, you know, you just really, I know these things seem burdensome. I know they seem sort of eye-rolling, but we're only on the second most important issue of the state attorneys general, and you can see how many ways this can come into play. Third is lack of internal controls. Now, usually you'll find a lack of internal controls if you go to an audit, because manager's letter, it will state a lack of internal controls if they find it. And in small shops, trust me, it can be hard to have one person open the mail, one person gift, another person put it in the bank. Another thing we can see with lack of internal controls, a lot of things are going online now. Your investment statements, your bank statements. If those are online, it's real easy not to look at them, right? So you still need to make sure you've got two people looking at things even when they're online. So please remember this, because this is where serial embezzlers know how to infiltrate your organization and to mess with it. And they know how to do this better than we know how to identify it. So we have to put the mechanisms in place to stop them or deter them. Because sometimes I've seen these people come in and you don't see it coming, right? So that's what I'll say there. Next is the bobblehead board. This is the idea that boards should not get along. Boards should discuss tough issues. Boards should debate what to do. Boards should have uncomfortable conversations. Because if they're not, are they pushing themselves? Are they really working through issues, or are they just letting one person say something and everyone says, oh, that sounds like a good idea, right? So I'm not saying they have to fight all the time. I'm not saying you want it to be unpleasant or uncomfortable. I am saying you want it to be uncomfortable sometimes. You want it to be unpleasant sometimes, because that means you're digging into the work, right? So don't overtake this. Don't start throwing things at each other. Be civil in your disagreements, but be willing to speak up. Have people on the board who will speak up. I know everyone has served on a committee or a board where they're like, oh gosh, Lara's at it again. She won't stop. She always brings this up. You know what? I know that's frustrating to sit through. I know sometimes you disagree with them. Maybe all the time you disagree with them. But at least you've got different people coming to the work with different opinions and different ways of evaluating. You don't have to agree with them, but I bet not everyone in your community agrees, right? So the board should reflect that. Okay, the last thing is donor intent on permanently restricted funds. So this goes back to public charities, and especially community foundations, have variance power, where the money, once it comes in, is theirs and no material restrictions can be on it. At the same time, if those funds come in restricted, the donor or donor family may have the ability to question how those funds were spent. And most often we see the fund investment being the problem, not the grant or program distribution of it, but it's actually the investment and the return on that. Now, I will say, donors can question this, right? But for the most part, the foundations do have control, exclusive legal control over the funds, and provided they documented and the board voted on how to move forward, and they have good paperwork on what the donor intent was, most of the time, community foundations come out the other side of a question on this. I don't see too much problem in interpretation, but you do want to be aware. Donor intent can't just be ignored. So if somebody said fund schools with this fund, or fund education with this fund, try to fund education, but education's a broad word, and the community foundation has the right to interpret that word, and as long as they appropriately document that, they may have done the work they needed to do. Okay, top federal charities issues. And again, this isn't something I got from the charities officials in a program, so you can't completely quote me on this because I am not a federal charities official, but this is what I gleaned from my many conversations and conferences with them. Ongoing donor control via conflicts of interest, private benefit, is a huge, huge, huge issue. And again, I don't get out of a meeting with anyone in Washington, D.C. without going through my paces on this. Second is transparency on where grants are coming from. So this idea is the government understands the purpose of anonymous gifts for certain circumstances. However, the government is increasingly interested in the look-through. Who gave the charitable funds and why? With individual donors, there is some safety in this process because it's well defined how funds have to be disclosed on Schedule B, even if somebody is anonymous to the public. When you get into a situation where, for example, a private foundation makes a grant and doesn't disclose, then you don't actually know that an individual is behind it. There's a foundation behind it where individual money went in, and you're not sure if the initial money into a private foundation getting over to a public charity has any control issues because you can't follow the money very well. This is the same thing if the private foundation fund goes into a donor advised fund and then it looks like the anonymous gift comes from the community foundation, but it came from somebody from the private foundation side. The government increasingly is talking about look-throughs and how do they see the look-through. Otherwise, how do they deal with private benefit and control issues? So this is something that is in hot debate right now, and certainly something that I'm in a lot of debates with them about right now, because while I understand their concerns, part of my job is to make sure we don't over-regulate the sector. So getting to a clarifying point on this and a middle ground is important, but I think the middle ground is going to be more transparency from the government and not less anytime soon. So anonymous grants, we understand. Think about how many there are. Think about think about how many there are and how many you're dealing with, and think about if the government wanted to look through. Do you, as the organization with those funds, know how to look through? Even if you can't get to who the anonymous person is, because you shouldn't always, do you know what the mechanisms would be for doing that? I know that's a little bit of a tricky one, but it's because it's in the middle of debate right now with regulators. There's also a question about transparency on applying for grants. Increasingly, the government is asking questions about why so many private foundations don't have websites, don't tell you how you can apply, specifically say you can't apply for grants. That's all goes to the idea of control and transparency, which are two of the biggest issues for regulators. So I'm not saying, again, that you shouldn't completely ban, the ability to apply, but you should really consider if you're a foundation that doesn't allow applications or inquiries or meetings or information about you online. Sometimes I know that people think of the altruistic lens and say, well, I don't want credit, or I don't want people to know what I give to. We understand. Just balance that with the idea of the perception of the organization that gets the gift or spends the funds. If they don't know where the funds are coming from, can they accept them in all cases? Because you have to at least know in some formation of how the money got to you, right? Or it's odd to accept it. I'm not saying that drug traffickers are bringing money into town, but you don't know. And again, I'm not making that. I'm sure that's not happening, but the government can't be sure unless you can show them routes to how somebody knows who's giving money and where it's going and that no one's controlling it. Or inappropriate persons aren't controlling it. Yes?
As opposed to somebody wishing to keep their name anonymous, the background, they still know where it is, but publicly or in publications, these are,
Correct. There's a difference between the annual report saying anonymous and the idea that if a federal or state charities official or the recipient entity at least needed to know, if they don't know who it comes from directly, where it came from to get to them from a legitimate entity. So basically, to say that better, if you're going to accept money, you need to know it's coming from a legitimate entity. And if you can't figure that out, and if you can't figure out if the grant that you're receiving is legitimate and should be accepted, you should consider whether it's a good idea to accept that money, even though I never want to tell anyone not to accept money because I know we all need it to run our nonprofit services. But you have to have some clarity. You have to have some ability to understand because there's going to be you can be questioned as well as the grantor. The grantee can also be questioned about, well, why did you accept that money if you didn't understand it? So just think about that. Again, I'm not coming on a hard line here, just think about it. And there are some situations where I understand the absolute value of anonymous donations, especially from individuals, when you don't want people to know if you're funding something that might be seen as controversial. Okay, next, investment in oversight of charitable mission. So, mission creep is maybe something you've heard of, or not understanding the charitable mission, or what percentage of the work goes towards charitable mission. I pointed to the Schedule O of Incourage because I actually think it's done quite well. And it answers a lot of questions about how they work toward their charitable mission. They don't leave the dots really far apart. They're quite close together. And even for things like owning a building or economic development work that are not charitable per se, but you have to prove it, that information was pretty clear for me, and again, everyone can interpret differently, but it was pretty clear for me when I read through Incourage's 990, and I'm just using theirs as an example because I looked at it last, but I could do that in any community. So, you know, I know that there's a tension between how much anyone wants the government to have versus not have, and all I'm saying is think about what your charities regulators are thinking as well. Because when we understand each other's perspectives, at least we can find a middle ground. You don't always have to agree with government regulation, but you have to follow it. And when it's a gray area, you have to determine how much risk you want to take on when you interpret that gray area. So that's what I'm saying. You can interpret how you want, but understand there's risk taking when you're doing the gray area interpretation. So for regulatory updates, I just wanted to say that the Council on Foundations writes to the Treasury once a year and asks them to prioritize issues, and then we comment when we think things are unclear. So recently, last year, we commented on the Form 990 and talked to them about vague sections. So some of this here is information we provided to them, and some of it is just what we think is hard to interpret. So I'll just point to a couple of these in our last few minutes. You know, defining a person and defining control is difficult, and we think the instructions could do a better job of making that clearer as you all fill it out. Another thing is number of employees defined. Employee is one of those tricky things in rule of law versus, or term of art versus term of law. In the law, an employee is somebody who gets a W-2. In practice, an employee is usually someone you see day to day in the office who works full time, who has access to benefits, right? Or something like that. So just understand that there may be a gap in interpretation of the word employee from the legal to the on the street consideration. Next thing is different, clarifying distributions from DAFs or from sponsoring organizations and not from individuals. So again, it's this idea of if money goes into something and it goes out through the community foundation, does the community foundation have ways to know that when it went out, the person who put it into the community foundation isn't controlling it on the other side? Does that make sense? It's something I'm in the middle of trying to figure out how to explain because I've been in so much dialogue with the Treasury. So if it doesn't make sense, push on me because I need to get better at explaining how when there's a conduit in between or when it's unclear, the Treasury is flustered or wants to know more. So those are, the last thing I'll say is Schedule B talks about who's a grantor or a donor to your organization. And sometimes people aren't sure how to fill it out. Is it only donors? Is it grantors? Which grantors? So we're just saying to them, you know, can we get clarity on these things so that, because we want to help foundations follow the law, and we think most foundations want to follow the law. So if you clarify how they can do that, that is very helpful. Okay, a couple things I suggest people be careful about when you look at a 990 or read a 990, and there's things I have to always remind myself. First, financial information is more meaningful viewed over a period of years. One of my biggest frustrations, I read this report year over year, and sometimes it says, well, this year, you know, this type of foundation's up and this one's down in investments, but the anomaly is over a 10-year period, they look exactly the same in their investment returns. And I'm like, that's not the anomaly, that's the trend, right? That's the long-term trend. So 1 year tells you something about 1 year. As we all know, investments in any single year or a program in any single year can look differently when you look at it year over year. So don't forget, and I also think if an organization is doing some transitions or making changes, if you look year over year, you probably can follow the trend. Next, financial indicators such as percentage of money spent on fundraising or programs or staff can be misleading because the way the government has you write them down may not be the way you think of them in the community. The best example I can give you, and I do this all the time in communities, is I hear from people, I don't have, my program expenses or my fundraising expenses are zero. And I'm like, well, what are all the people in your office doing, right? Well, they're fundraising, and I say, okay, so you have a person who fundraises. Does that person use a computer to do the fundraising? Does that person use office resources? Do they, plan events in the community? That's all fundraising expenses, even though when you see a person, you think operating. That's not necessarily true. Imagine a classroom with no teacher in the front of it. Is it still a classroom, right? So programming and fundraising has to include people. Otherwise, I don't know how it gets done. There may be some artificial intelligence community that is doing this, but I don't know of them. So programming and fundraising expenses, some people think about the staff, some people keep it separate, and then you start comparing apples and oranges because of interpretation on the 990. So I just want to be clear. I actually wish I would see more in programming and fundraising to balance out operations, because so many times we hear, operations shouldn't be more than a quarter of all funds. But it depends how you define operations. Is it the lights on in the building? Is it, what exactly is it? So there's something called the overhead myth, and it's done by some very reputable institutions in the field talking about what does overhead really mean? Does it need to be only a certain percentage? What does it mean to get the work done? Because if we don't fund the people that gets the work done, are we funding the work? So just think about that. I know a lot of us think, volunteers can handle everything that social services do. My father's a social worker, right? I don't think somebody who's a volunteer should be acting as a licensed clinical social worker. I hope somebody is not volunteering to be a lawyer, right? I mean, if they're a lawyer, maybe. But so just think about that, because I know in communities there is a long view perception of nonprofits as non-technical, non-specialized, anyone can do it, and I just don't think that's true, especially when we're chipping away at the most persistent societal issues. So just consider what that means on the 990 and what it doesn't mean. Last, how is a public charity effective and efficient? The Form 990 doesn't address this. This is where impact studies or community forums on how are we doing kind of come into play. And again, with community organizations specifically, if you're a generalist organization, your evaluation is going to cost a lot of money if you go through a scientific evaluation, because you've got to do an evaluation on health, education, environment, every single thing that you do. Whereas if you're a foundation that focuses on polio, you might just be able to focus on polio research. So give everyone some leeway on evaluation of impact, and really talk to your community members and have the community speak out about, do they feel the impact of the mission or do they not? But understand that the measurement of that by the 990 or another tool is trickier than it sounds. So that's 2 hours. I could talk, clearly I can talk all day, but I will wrap up here and turn it over to Christopher, and maybe you all have questions. I'll be here, don't worry, I won't run away, but I do know some of you probably have other things to do today. Thank you.